Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in today's lesson is the concept of organized labor. At the end of this presentation, students will be able to examine the causes and consequences of the Second Industrial Revolution, analyze changes as the United States became an industrial society, examine the causes, course, and consequences of the labor movement, and review different economic and philosophic ideologies. Terms to know: sweatshop, company town, collective bargaining, socialism, Knights of Labor, Terence v. Powderly, Samuel Gompers, AFL, the Haymarket Riot, the Homestead Strike, Eugene v. Debs, and the Pullman Strike. Many workers in America toiled in what are referred to as sweatshops. And when we look at these sweatshops, we look at some of the really poor conditions that existed when people worked there. These workers were often foreign-born, they lacked good English-speaking skills, and were often very, very poor. And when they worked in these factories, they weren't going to make very much money in the first place. So the idea of kind of pulling yourself out of that being poor by working in these factories was not something that worked out very well for most people. Factory workers often worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, in small, hot, dark, and dirty warehouses. And that's why they were referred to as sweatshops, because you would go into these really small, hot, and dark places and spend 12 hours a day there. And it's not something that anybody would have ever looked forward to being able to do. So it's a pretty negative concept when you look at the conditions these individuals worked in. Those who worked in mining towns lived in isolated communities near their workplace. The housing areas were known as company towns, and there's a reason why they're known as company towns. And that's because everything that happened within that town was owned by the company. So you would go and you would work in the mine, or you would work kind of whatever that company was focused on, and they would pay you. But then when you went to go to lay in bed at the end of the night, the bed that you slept in and the building that you slept in was more than likely owned by the company. So you were going to turn around and take the money that they paid you in salary, and you would pay to live there. When you went to the general store to be able to buy food or any other supplies that you needed, everything that you bought there was owned by the company, so you were going to once again take that money that you had just made working in the factory, those very low wages, and you would pay it back to the company who just paid you. So pretty much it was a way of keeping people in the roles that they were in without really any social mobility, because pretty much no matter what, you were going to walk away with a net sum of zero. They were going to make sure that you had the food and the place to sleep to keep you as a productive worker, but you're never going to get out of that. And this is really known as wage slavery, because there is no escape. And pretty much in a lot of these circumstances, you ended up owing more to the company than what they paid you, which meant that you could really never leave, because you couldn't leave that debt behind. So this is when we see the rise of the labor unions, and we start to see these things start to come up. So in the 1820s, factories workers used a technique referred to as collective bargaining, and this is when we really first start to see this. This is a system of negotiating as a group for higher wages or better working conditions. In order to gain leverage, what workers would do is they would strike, and they would try and force the hand of the employer. And the idea behind that is, well, yes, I might be losing wages in the short term by striking, but in the long term, I'm going to force the hand of the employer to pay me more money, to give me better working conditions, and things like that. So in the early 1820s is when we really start to see this start to show up. We don't really start to see this hit its stride until the late 1800s, early 1900s. So in 1869, Uriah Smith Stephens founded a group called the Knights of Labor. This group actively recruited African Americans and devoted their time to bring broad social reform to the country. The widely adopted socialist idea that wealth should be distributed amongst the people rather than concentrated in a wealthy elite was something that was really a huge concept of the Knights of Labor, and they really wanted to ensure that everybody had the opportunity to earn a living wage. So by the late 1800s, a man named Terence v. Powderly took over the Knights of Labor and continued to push for economic reform. Boycotts and strikes were used extensively to try and protect workers that made up every race and gender. The group eventually failed after a series of failed strike attempts, because in these instances the companies were able to either hire scabs, people to come in and work in the factories that weren't part of the union, or they were able to use their wealth to be able to outlast the people who really needed the jobs to be able to survive. In 1886, Samuel Gompers formed the American Federation of Labor. The AFL was a craft union that pooled money to create a strike and pension fund to assist workers in need, something that the Knights of Labor didn't have. And so when you've got this fund set up to be able to support your workers as they strike, it makes it much easier for them to be able to survive during these issues. The AFL also pressed for what they refer to as closed shops. So what a closed shop is that in order to be able to work within that factory, you must be part of the union, and it prevents that business from hiring anyone outside of that union, which once again was something that did not exist with the Knights of Labor, which would provide the union with a lot more leverage to be able to create change within the system. They also opposed women members, and local branches of the organization often excluded racial minorities. So there are some major strikes that take place during this time period that really caused a lot of issues within the country. On May 1st, 1886, thousands of workers mounted a national demonstration for an 8-hour workday. Strikes took place in many cities, and fights broke out between strikers and strike breakers. And that 8-hour workday, as we know, based upon today's modern standard, is something that really takes hold. One of the big riots that takes place was something called the Haymarket Square Riot on May 4th. Dozens of people were killed as fighting between police, anarchists, who, what they did is they tried to use the labor issues in the United States as a way to try and take hold. And which is why a lot of people really started to have a huge negative viewpoint on these unions, because a lot of times they got linked together, even though that really wasn't the case, because the unions didn't want anarchy. They actually wanted a lot more government control over what was going on. So when you look at what the unions wanted and the anarchists wanted, they were very, kind of polar opposite as far as what they were trying to achieve. But the anarchists are trying to seize upon this this concept of disunity that exists within the country at this point, and they're really trying to create a lot of influence and to be able to change a lot of things, which is why so many people look down upon the unions kind of at this point. And there's also a lot of violence between the strikers and the strike breakers. So there's a lot of violence, there's bombs going off, there's all sorts of major issues that go on. And then in the summer of 1892, a Carnegie steel plant cut wages at a steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Riots broke out, and Andrew Carnegie's partner, Henry Fick, was almost assassinated. Even though the Union had nothing to do with the assassination plot, the two were connected in the public eye, and the strike was called off. So we've got two major strikes here, the Haymarket Square riot, and we've got the Homestead riot here, that when we look at these strikes, because the anarchists are kind of inserting themselves into this, it's causing a lot of negative publicity for unions in the country, and it's causing a lot of just normal people to really not want to support these movements. Another one of the major strikes that takes during this time period is in 1893, where workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company, a company that made luxury railroad cars, laid off workers and reduced wages by 25%. Workers that went to negotiate with George Pullman regarding wage increases were largely fired, and the plant was shut down in protest of workers' demands. Eugene V. Debs, who ran the American Railroad Union, organized a strike. The strike shut down rail traffic throughout the country, which hurt business and the U.S. Post Office. Now, here's where the thing came in. Most of the time, the government really stayed out of these strikes because they didn't want to set a precedent as far as what their involvement should be. But because this strike hurt what was going on within the railroad, hurt what was going on with the postal service, and it prevented mail from being delivered all around the country, this becomes a federal issue. And it really is breaking federal law because you're not allowed to impede the movement of mail within the United States. So what ends up happening is Grover Cleveland shows up, and he sends federal troops to put down the strike and to put these people back to work. So we really see the Pullman strike kind of crushed by what the federal government does here at the end.